Canary flew through the sky, gazing down longingly at the sprawling landscape from the cloud covers. Acres of farmland and a small town by a river were bustling with people, despite the late hour, walking around tending to their everyday activities. Though since it was the modern era, many were glued to their phones half the time. They couldn't see Canary, but he could see every little detail. His seven senses were sharp, even for an immortal dragon, and from thousands of feet above the ground, he could observe without fear of being attacked. Not that it would actually do much for him. Okay, but honestly, what were humans thinking when they threw tiny rocks and shot metal pebbles at the scales of a dragon? Did they think they would harden them? Canary was quite literally ancient. He was as old as time, existing before darkness was a concept, before the first stars were scattered in the sky, before the first sun rose above the horizon, before life and growth and darkness were a thing. His white-yellow scales glinted faintly in the soft moonlight. Morala was full tonight, like the white eye of a great celestial being. She was particularly happy today, and not even the clouds that night could dim her cheery moonlight. Circling above the town, Canary peered into the windows of the houses one by one. Shoot. He couldn't remember where they were. The particular family he was looking for had just moved that day, and he couldn't circle above human civilization during the daytime for fear of scaring the humans, no matter how high. He just wanted to hear the stories. There! Changing directions, swooping around, his red eyes narrowing in on a window. Inside the building, through the glass, was a little girl's room. Simple and cute, with an abundance of stuffed animals and what seemed to be some kind of colorful cube. Oh, right, they were called Rubik's Cubes. Also Rubik's Pyramids, Rubik's Spears, Rubik's weirdly shaped abominations. The little girl, a young second grader with blonde ponytails and bright amber eyes, was being tucked into bed by her father, who was going to have to leave the next day to serve in the military. He smirked playfully as he pressed a kiss to her forehead, while she tried to push him away, a smile gracing her own lips. Canary tuned in to their conversation as the father spoke. "Which story did you want to hear tonight again?" he asked his daughter. He lifted the covers and settled down on the bed next to her. "Oi, Scoot. Yeah, there you go. Okay." He reached up to grab for a book, but the little girl stopped him. "Can you tell me that story about the stars again?" Her father smiled awkwardly. "Again? Didn't I tell you that story just last week? And the week before? Aren't you bored of it?" Giggling, his daughter picked up one of her stuffed animals, a little yellow bird that would have been any kind of bird, but seemed to strike Canary as familiar, and held it up. She waved it up and down as if imagining it in flight. "No, I like that story. Can you tell it to me again? Please, please, please?" After some back and forth between the father and daughter, he finally relented and sighed. "All right, fine," he said, patting her small head. Canary saw him raise his eyes up to where the ceiling fan hung. The nightlight at the desk provided enough light to see clearly, but not enough to blind anyone. So, once upon a time, in another world, beyond the heavens and the stars, and before their creation, there was a lonely ferryman living in a lonely place. He'd gotten lost and stranded after his ferry got carried down a river with strong currents while he was on it. He had hit his head and fell unconscious. When he woke, somehow, he was still in his ferry, but had been carried completely out of the water. He stood up and found himself deep in the forests and mountains, in a clearing with the largest, clearest, calmest lake he'd ever seen. He didn't know if it was even a lake at all. But, of course, it was. It was just special and sacred, and he somehow knew it was sacred, so he left it alone. He lived there for several years, after building himself a cottage to call home, and befriended the local native creatures. They were all special, but we don't know what they look like. They're all said to have feathers with the power of flight and have magic in their veins. They all have unique names: crow, vulture, owl, eagle, and canary. He then went on to describe all the characteristics of each creature. Canary had heard all this millions of times. Crow, the mischievous but clever one. Vulture, the cunning and scheming. Owl, the wily and active. Eagle, the free and observant, and Canary, the playful and melodious. Canary himself always found the story a little funny. It definitely captured the 5 dragons' personalities, but he never knew how. The other dragons who had existed since the beginning of time alongside him were nowhere as friendly as Canary. They wouldn't be willing to sit down in a nice room on a couch and answer questions about the 5 of them. The first answer the humans would get would be a loud roar and a fireball in the face. And yet, for some reason, the humans always seemed to think he was the biggest threat. Not even Vulture had less fanfare than him, and he was the epitome of disaster. Owl was convinced that the large brown dragon was going to be the reason the human zombie apocalypse started one day. Canary brought himself back to the present and listened as the Royal Navy sailor spoke on his last day with his daughter before he was dispatched. Over the years, the ferryman did not dare touch the lake's water. None of the creatures dared to either. Not even fallen leaves dare fall onto its surface. But then one day, he looked across the lake and saw people. Real, actual people, standing by the water's edge. They were waving and shouting the ferryman's name. He couldn't believe his eyes. He thought he would be stuck there forever, but now he actually has a chance to get back into human society. The little girl gasped. And what did he do? Like she hadn't heard it all before, she leaned in close to her father, who had gotten quiet. Canary felt a squeeze of disappointment in his chest. Was he going to end it here? Seriously? The day before his assignment? Canary flapped his wings and circled around again, swinging his large white-yellow head so he could keep looking through that tiny window from up above. He had known the man to be prone to cliffhangers, but that was brutal, even for a story that both the girl and the dragon knew. Well, it was a story everyone knew, but that was besides the point. Her father grinned and ruffled the little girl's hair before undoing the hair ties for her. Well, I guess you'll just have to find out next time when I come back to finish it. The little girl pouted. What? No fair! Then she paused and said, in a quieter tone, You will come back, right, Dad? You'll come back and you'll finish the story right next to me like this, right? Promise? He held out his pinky finger, chuckling. Of course. Pinky promise. I'll come back. The little girl linked their little fingers. All right, promise. No breaking it, or else the eagle will come and get you. They both laughed and told a few more jokes together before the little girl was tucked in to sleep. The father retreated into his room. Canary followed his progress, sensing his saddened and solemn mood. His wife was already asleep, with a small smile on her face. He smiled and looked out the window. All signs of mirth were drained out of him as he stared at the night sky, not seeing Canary, despite the feeling that he was looking straight at him. "I hope I won't break it, Abby," he whispered to himself. "Please, Five Dragons, don't let me break this promise. Just this once." The father turned and got ready for bed. Canary felt his heart clench before gritting his fangs and forcing himself to dip one wing, and turned away. He flew off. He shouldn't have stayed there for that long. It was dangerous to develop human attachment, especially one-sided ones. It's dangerous to hear them swear something on the Five Dragons as well. They had all learned that lesson the hard way, many times. As he left the human settlement behind, his heart felt heavy with the unfulfilled promises, wishes, and hopes of hundreds of thousands of people. And another one was just added to the mix. His plan began with an assist from Crow. Well, really, it was less of an assist than an ambush. Canary was doing his routine flight around the continent the next morning. On his patrols, he flew below the cloud covers to ensure he could see everything for miles. But this meant that everyone on the earth down below could see him, and he was occasionally in the path of jets, planes, and other aircrafts. But he avoided them easily, even as they blew their high-frequency whistle designed to warn dragons of incoming flights. Funny story, when the other dragons first heard that whistle, silent to the humans but loud, shrill, and ear-piercing to dragons, they all freaked out except for Owl. Not many things could freak out Owl. Vulture fell from the sky and nearly flattened a patch of forest. Eagle shrieked so loudly Canary's ears rang for weeks afterward. Crow smacked Canary with his tail. Why? It might have been because Canary was the one who gathered everyone and had them listen to the new development in human technology. Canary was always the one who kept up with the human world the most. Owl, Eagle, Crow, and Vulture all valued their privacy. They hid in the high peaks and cold tundras and dry savannas. Crow swung by human cities occasionally, but never without reason. In the present, he could hear a cacophony of noises from below as they spotted the white-yellow dragon soaring above them. "Canary! Look out, everyone! It's the sign of danger! Honey, get in the building, quick!" He did his best to ignore them as he turned inland to continue his path. Just as he cleared the city, however, a black shape dropped from the clouds, the larger dragon swerving and catching himself directly above him. Canary flapped his wings, slowing to a stop. "Crow, you sneaky little If you call me a bird, I will smack you with my tail again," Crow said. Calling a dragon a bird was a great insult. It was like calling a human a monkey. He grinned toothily. "You weren't quite sharp this time, though. I would have fallen on you if I hadn't stopped myself." He glared at the other dragon, whose black scales glittered like obsidian in the sunlight. I just had something in my mind, that's all." Crow moved through the air to fly alongside him. A mysterious star-shaped scar on his wing, under and on it, was obvious against his black scales. Its origin was unknown, but it had been there since the beginning. "Well, what is it, Pipsqueak? Is it about the military family in the Southwest again?" Something in his tone suggested that he had known beforehand. Canary wasn't surprised. "Yeah." "Why don't you just reveal yourself? Communicate with them." He knew Crow was up to something. He never asked questions he knew the answers to, and all the other 4 dragons knew about Canary's obsession with the humans, specifically that one family. The only reason for Crow to ask that question is to make it seem like the conversation is flowing, when actually he already knew what he was going to say 5 lines before he actually said it. It was usually for Vulture's benefit, who, despite being smarter than he seemed, was slow compared to the other dragons. He wanted to tell Crow that he wasn't Vulture, but the latter could be quite stubborn when it came to his questionable ways of communication. It would be faster to play along. "I can't. I'm a dragon," Canary said flatly, dipping one wing and turning north. Partly because it was part of his patrol path, but also because he didn't want Crow to read his face like an open book. "Their lifespans are a blink of an eye compared to me. You remember the first days of civilization?" The first days of civilization. The time when the 5 dragons made connections and friends and aided the humans in their troubles. Just a few decades later, however, instead of feeling joy from having other sentient beings around, it was pure grief and pain for at least a century. That was when the others isolated themselves. At that, even Crow had to pause for a second and steal his composure. Apparently, he hadn't expected that response. Canary always seemed to catch him by surprise. "Well, what if you have a choice?" He perked up, looking over his shoulder to stare at Crow. "What?" Crow flapped his powerful wings, lashing his tail, to catch up with Canary. They flew over a mountain range, level with the snow-kissed peaks. Crow had a toothy grin on his face, his fangs baring in what to humans seemed like a threatening gesture. "I've found something. It's an old legend, but there's evidence behind it to support it." The sand-colored dragon brushed his claws against the snow, dislodging some and possibly causing an avalanche. "Hang on, answer me. What choice?" "I know you felt out of place," Crow stated. "I know that you felt like you haven't found your purpose. All the while, we've found what we want to do in our existence." Crow stopped sharply and turned to him. "Just tell me!" Crow landed on the mountain and shivered as his talons sank into the snow. He breathed a bit of fire to melt it, tucking his right wing close to himself. "Well, you know the story of the ferryman who poked holes in the heavens?" Oh, who didn't know that story? It was the little girl, Abby's, favorite story, as well as Canary's. He knew it by heart. But it was just a story, a legend. Canary wasn't sure how the 5 dragons got integrated into the story, and over the years, it became their origin story. In reality, none of the dragons actually knew how they came to be. They just knew their first memories were of seeing rivulets of stars and the moon form in the sky, bringing light to the world. The ferryman wasn't real, and the heavens were not a lake in some other world. Morala, the moon, was the closest thing they had to a mother, and though she was unreachable and eternally far away, in a way even Owl couldn't understand, and oftentimes considered just an inanimate object in the sky, there was a certain yearning the dragons felt. They had never spoken to her, never truly interacted with her, but they felt that she was not just a large spherical rock. Her glow at night called to them, and she brought them comfort. She wasn't created from a tear caused by the ferryman. Canary didn't respond, but Crow barged on anyway. I did some research and scoured the continent. Turns out the ferryman is very, very real. So is the story. He's joking, Canary concluded. His outward appearance was calm, but his inner self was reeling. He has to be. The ferryman? Real? So then, what did that mean for the dragons? But it couldn't be real. Morala was an entity in the sky, a living being. Yet at the same time, Crow didn't kid about these things. Personal things, like their origin. He's also here, in this world, with us. The larger dragon turned his head, stretching his neck to peer down the mountain at a fertile valley, hidden by cliffs of the tallest mountains in the continent on all sides. Canary had never seen this valley before, despite having flown through the Astra mountain range more times than he could count. And he could count quite a lot. He followed Crow's gaze and saw what could have been dismissed as just a dense patch of forest. But when he narrowed his sharp eyes, he realized that it was actually a cleverly interwoven structure disguised among the woods. He began to fear what or who was inside. And he's also right there, Crow said, confirming his suspicions. There was a moment of silence. Crow looked at Canary. This is what was left out of the legend. After he created the stars by accident, he looked for the 5 creatures. Us. He wanted us to join him on the other side, but it simply wasn't possible. He decided it would be fine as long as we were all together, so he jumped into the lake. His black tail lashed with anger before he calmed himself. I've already met him. I asked him about you. That brought Canary out of his trance. There was no longer any doubt that he was joking. You did? Why? Like I said, you're the one who can't seem to find a meaning in your existence, other than look out for humans that don't deserve your attention. I think you should hear the answer from him yourself, however. Humans that don't deserve my attention? Really? Canary spent the majority of his time around the humans, learning about them, understanding them, and trying to interact with them, but they never considered actually befriending him. Despite his constant presence, his friendly nature, his willingness to help humankind, and his love for their species, no man or woman has ever tried to interact with them for any reason other than to make an attempt at stabbing him or wanting something from him. He never killed a human in his life. He just turned them away gently and flew away if they still waved their swords or guns at him. He simply didn't understand why they seemed to fear him or simply despised his existence, and not the others. Even as the smallest of the 5 dragons, he towered over the tallest humans, 15 feet tall at the shoulders. And yet, the second smallest, Crow, whose shoulders were 20 feet tall, got more positive intention than Canary. For a while, he thought helping mankind was his purpose. In the last 100 years, however, 3 major wars had ravaged the continent, and countless died. His heart had filled with more and more outraged screams and despairing cries from the dead or dying. His presence over every battlefield had the people discarding their fear of the dragons and asking, hoping, wishing to live through the day. The people were going to wipe themselves out one day. Canary was trying to make sure that didn't happen. It wasn't like anyone listened. So he decided that maybe Crow was right. Maybe he did need to change. Without another word, he opened his wings and leaped off the mountain summit, diving towards the little cottage in the woods. The rest of the story of the ferryman who poked holes in the heavens went something like this. The ferryman, desperate to return to civilization, hopped on his ferry and pushed himself into the lake with his oar, and headed across the lake to meet the humans. He was happy and excited, too much so. When he pushed his ferry off the shore and into the lake, his oar punctured a hole in the lake's surface. Below the water, it seemed like the contact with the oar had caused some kind of reaction at the bottom of the lake, creating a luminescent glowing circle. In another world, a round spotlight seemed to appear in the sky. Morala, the moon, had formed. As he rowed, every time he brought his oar down to the calm lake, the water was disrupted, and a small shining light seemed to erupt from the spot where it was contacted. In the other world, tiny diamonds winked and glittered to life, the first stars. The ferry cut through the water. Dozens of stars trailed in his wake, filling the other world with light. A pattern could be seen, however, a long tear stretching across the lake. The ferryman was so focused on making it to the other side, he disregarded the friends he made, who kept him company, who helped him through the hard times, who cared about him. Eagle tried to call him back, and went to the shore. Her voice went unheard, however, and as she tried to take off and fly across the lake, something flew by under her wing. A human arrow shot from one of the people on the other side. It took a few of her feathers, and she, startled, fell into the lake. She went under and disappeared, falling into the newly created world with a dragon body. The others, alarmed, rushed forward to see if they could save her, flying above where she'd sank into the water. Vulture, bold as always, dove straight into the water and disappeared as well. Crow flew close to the surface, hoping to avoid the human's arrows while looking for his friends. One of the arrows punctured his right wing and took him down into the lake. Owl went next, dodging 2 arrows, trying to call to the ferryman, as he seemed to be their only other option, but he did not hear her. A moment later, after an arrow grazed her feathers, narrowly missing her neck, she dove into the water after sending a resentful glare to the ferryman and the other humans. Canary had been hiding in the trees the entire time, watching the humans. No one knew what he was thinking at that moment and what he was feeling. But after Owl went down, he decided to approach them with a different tactic. He came out of hiding with a clover and flew across the lake. The people on the other side were confused and didn't shoot him down. The ferryman was already ashore by the time Canary flew to their side. He looked back and finally realized where his other 4 friends went. "I'm so sorry," the ferryman cried to Canary as he circled above the heads of the group of people. "I didn't mean to." Canary didn't glance at him before he dropped the clover in the hands of the human who forced his friend to fall into the river. "Eat it," Canary suggested. "It's good for you." Then he flew back across the lake. But despite his kind offer, the human grabbed an arrow and shot Canary anyway. It pierced his heart, forcing him to drop, dead, into the body of water. The human ate the clover, but as he swallowed, he choked and fell to his knees, keeling over before dying just as quickly. It hadn't been a clover. It had been a 4-leaved false shamrock, and it was poisonous. Canary had avenged his friend as well as himself. The ferryman could only watch as his last friend, who was by his side through thick and thin, died in front of him. That was the usual end of the ferryman who poked holes in the heavens. But after hearing the ferryman's explanation to himself, Crow knew it didn't end there. My real name is Kenneth, but when I spread my story, I decided I don't deserve to be recognized or immortalized. Meanwhile, the ferryman could be anyone. It's better if I'm forgotten in time. He had wallowed in despair for days before going back to the lake, and, realizing the gravity of his mistakes, decided to jump into it as well, to attempt atoning for his actions. Kenneth arrived in the world of the 5 dragons at the dawn of civilization, and had been there ever since. He explained that he decided to stay away from the 5 dragons in an attempt to let them live their lives in peace, here, where the humans couldn't hurt them. It wasn't right. It wasn't right that you had to die for my own short-sightedness. You had feelings. You had your own thoughts and emotions. You were all magical creatures, in more ways than one. You didn't leave me, unlike my own species. And I think I paid the price for choosing humans after the 5 of you fell through the hole you called the moon, Morala. Crow had asked Kenneth question after question. The result was a sense of relief and calmness. He had always had questions, and he was glad they were finally resolved and answered. After Kenneth rejoined society, his life took a turn for the worse. He spent so long away from other people that they didn't see him as another one of them. They called him weird and odd and beat him up in alleyways and threw him in dumpsters. He was too afraid to go back to being a ferryman, and ended up with the same group as the one who died to Canary's false shamrock. A group of poor poachers stuck in the olden days with bows and arrows. When they accidentally killed the king of another country while hunting exotic animals, they fled to yet another country while a worldwide war erupted. After which I came back to the lake and dove in. The death of Canary, lovable, friendly Canary, had been a sign of destruction. Crow had frowned. How can he be a sign of destruction? How? Canary? It's in every history book as well. Canary, the 5th dragon, is a sign of destruction. Why, Kenneth? Crow was smart, but this he could never understand, until now. Kenneth had simply smiled. It wasn't a good smile, however. It was a painful smile, one that carried grief and mourning that lingered for millennia. Oh, no, Canary can never be the sign of destruction. And it's actually incorrect. He's not a sign of destruction. History twisted that bit. He's the warning. To be more precise, his death is the warning. In my world, Canary greatly resembled a type of bird, which went by the same name. Its death was commonly regarded as an indicator for disaster. The poacher killed Canary before eating the poisonous shamrock. Then, ignoring how ethically wrong their and mine actions had been, we went on to start a war. And now there's also a war approaching this continent. How can you tell? That was a habit. To question something he already knew the answer to. He knew the relations between the nations were strained. He knew it wouldn't be long before one side struck. The First Worldwide War, including the islanders, the settlements on a newfound continent, and the formerly neutral Northerners, was about to commence, and it would bring absolute devastation, especially with the newly developed bombs. Mankind might end before the year is over, Crow thought to himself. Kenneth had sensed that Crow knew the answer already. Then again, Kenneth had known Crow before he even remembered knowing himself. But the ward could be contained and maybe even completely avoided. The only way that would happen would be to warn everyone of the dangers and consequences to come. Crow asked, "How?" and instantly regretted it. Thankfully, Kenneth didn't answer. He didn't need to. Crow flew off immediately after. Crow, in his secluded forest in the middle of the continent, was out for a morning flight 2 days after he'd brought Canary to Kenneth, when he felt it, or rather, saw it. 2 days prior, Canary had come back to the mountain peak, a flat look on his face, a groove between his brows. It smoothed out when he saw Crow, however, and he asked Crow if he could fly with him the rest of his flight path. Crow agreed, and was surprised, pleasantly so, when Canary seemed to return to his cheerful, happy self, and conversed with the black dragon the entire way. Crow couldn't help but be relieved. He'd brought Canary there after a second talk session with Kenneth, to convince Canary to stay away from the humans. It was a roundabout way of doing it, but he figured it would be better for Canary that way, because if the other humans were going to wipe themselves out, Crow didn't want Canary to be attached to them anymore, to think he was obliged to stay with them. He didn't want Canary to carry their oaths and dreams and to help the humans that were doing nothing to help him back. The 5 dragons were all the same age, but if they all agreed on one thing, it was that Canary was the youngest. He acted that way, and they treated him that way. He was playful, bright, and the most friendly creature in the universe. What the other dragons were unaware of was his burden. Crow sensed it only a century ago, and couldn't believe he hadn't seen it sooner. It was during a civil war of one of the largest human nations. Crow was forced to pass by overhead because he was rushing, even though he didn't want to. The desperate, useless, broken promises humans made to survive through the battle settled in his heart, and he wanted to puke afterwards. But then he spotted Canary, flying above the battlefield, openly surveying what was below, an unreadable expression on his face. Crow couldn't believe his eyes. How was he being so calm while flying through all this chaos? When he went to check in on Canary after the battle was over, he found him curled up tight in a ball, whispering endlessly to himself, repeating all the promises that were sworn through him and shattered like a vase. Crow recognized the symptoms. It had been apparent in all 5 dragons during the first centuries of human civilization, before 4 of the 5 retreated to the wilderness to stay away from the humans' countless broken oaths made through the 5 dragons, the causes of the symptoms. It had been terrible and overwhelming, yet Canary had kept doing this for millennia. I hope Kenneth talked some sense into him, Crow thought to himself, taking off into the morning air. Kenneth had not. There was a flash, and something blazed in the sky like a second sun. It was blinding, but only for a second. A very long second, it turned out. Visions flitted across his mind, of fires, of flattened cities, of destroyed homes and crumbling mountains, of floods invading the land, of ash clouds so terrifying they blocked out the sun for months. Years passed in the span of a heartbeat, filled with tears and blood and countless broken spirits of the living. It was short, but long. One message seemed to piece itself together through the vision. The canary is dead. This is your sign, your warning. Ignore it and you'll despair. Take it and you'll live. The canary is dead. Crow plummeted back into the clearing of his nest. He curled himself into a ball, remembering the heart-aching image of Canary in the same position a century ago. He covered his head with his wings, one of which had been shot in his past life, and felt greater despair than any other being on the planet. The canary is dead. Canary is dead. And this was his fault.